It is January 28th of 2026. My name is Gordon William Francis Young, and this is the first of many, 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 many weekly blogs that I'll be taking to keep track of my newly commenced PhD project. PhD project is entitled The Ethical Limitations of Ideas, Countering Online Extremist Movements with Artificial Intelligence. That last bit is a bit of a new addendum, so we're going to work through that. That'll probably be the subject of the next topic. So, the initial research question for this PhD is, under what circumstances is it ethically justifiable for ethics boards of government and private sector agencies to monitor or limit the circulation of ideas on social media with artificial intelligence as part of efforts to counter online hate and extremism? Bit of a mouthful. The essence, though, is that we have seen an enormous volume of online hate develop over the last however long, 10-ish years or so. We'll be able to define that a lot more clearly after the course of this PhD research process. And that has led to very tangible results, more every year. In recent times, as of the 28th of January, we've had the Bondi attacks up in Sydney, which were a little close to home for me personally, given I was there at the time or in the state at the time and had a couple of friends very close by. Fortunately, I didn't know anyone directly affected, but nonetheless. And then more recently, the pipe bombing attack in Perth against the Invasion Day protesters, which fortunately did not detonate, but nonetheless was a pipe bomb attack for political purposes. Before all of that, we've also got sovereign citizens and the anti-vax movement during the COVID years. Before all of that, we obviously had ISIS back in the day, which managed to recruit a number of disenfranchised Australians or vulnerable individuals into those causes. It was one of their main recruitment tactics at the time. So the question we have and the challenge that we have is, how do you regulate and can you ethically regulate an idea, not just conduct, not just behavior, not just uh, illegal content or conduct that is against terms of service, but the idea itself? If you can, how can you then regularly apply, effectively, practically apply it on a platform, and an online platform? Now, there's a lot going on with this. A lot going on with this. It is to be completely blunt, this is an extremely dangerous topic. I've got a lot of risks written down as part of my initial commencement presentation, and the biggest one by far is overregulation or regulatory overreach. The absolute last thing I want to do in this PhD is to give any powerful institution a rationalization or pseudo justification to regulate legitimate political speech. I may utterly loathe extremist groups, particularly Nazi groups and fascists, but they are significantly, at least in their current state, significantly less dangerous than any government with excessive power and a willingness to use it. This all, again, is taking place in the context of the hate speech laws that are currently being developed in response to the Bondi attacks back in December last year, 2025. And the rushed nature of that and the political theatre that's been surrounding it. So that leaves me in a difficult position because while I do believe that this can be accomplished ethically, it's going to operate in a very, very dangerous context. So, how to do this? First, we need to first we need to do an awful lot of literature review. So that's going to be the first thing first. I have my commencement presentation coming up in 3 weeks or 2.5 weeks, and that'll be a good opportunity to get to know my supervisory board. Looking forward to that, very excited. And from there, we can start to learn. I'm going to have to do a lot of reading. I've got to find out what the existing context of all of this is, who's already done work in this space, what successes and failures have already occurred, so that I can develop upon them. The AI angle is an interesting one, and it's one that's currently up for debate somewhat. It's my supervisor's recommendation that we funnel this entire thing through an AI perspective, as in using AI, the use of AI to spread hateful messages, as well as the use of AI to regulate or limit the spread of these ideas. So this is extremely relevant and also extremely beneficial. It focuses the scope of the PhD and will also give me specialization into an emergent area. Very, very valuable. I mean, the whole point, if you're not familiar, for PhD is to become an expert in an area where there are no other experts yet, to do something completely original. Big challenge, especially compared to other academia that I've done so far. I mean, everything else is sort of part of the academic movement. PhD, you're hyper specialized and you become an expert in something that no one has done, or at least not to that extent. This is very well trod ground. Freedom of speech versus security is not exactly a new topic. The online platforms angle certainly adds a bit there. Mind you, I will say that the freedom of speech versus security thing is something we've never successfully navigated in any sort of way that could be expanded without being absolutely terrifying. And as I said before, my main concern here is overregulating or enabling illegitimate regulation of speech. But at the same time, there's no arguing about the fact that well, I mean, let's be very clear on it. We have literal Nazis, not a epitaph, not an exaggeration, no hyperbole whatsoever. We have literal self-identifying Nazis running around. If those people were to succeed in getting power in the state, they would, if history is anything to go by, seek to genocide 1/3 of the population, roughly. And that is the worst possible ethical outcome. So we have some extremes to deal with here. So, first, the reading. Secondly, the ethical framework. We must establish an ethical means by which this can be done. That's going to be more challenging than it sounds. Nazis are an easy one because and that's why they're a good starting point, because they're so incredibly profoundly evil, and history clearly demonstrates this. But moving up from that, white supremacists, definitely still disgusting, vile, unethical people, or ideology, but we've gotten more complex. There's a reason there's a distinction between those two groups. Further up the complexity scale, then you're talking about ending immigration, the one nations of the world, right? Now, these are not as overtly evil because they tend to combine legitimate and illegitimate points, right? There's clear racism mixed into the anti-immigration crowd. Let's not beat around the bush on this. I'm not working for the government anymore. I don't have to pretend that there's grey to this situation. There ain't. So there's the racist elements of that speech, but then there's also, or that movement, but there's also compounded in on it, and why it is much more of a mainstream movement than, white supremacists or the Nazis, is that they compound that with legitimate concerns. Housing affordability, cost of living, suppression of wages, sustainability of a growing population, etc., etc. Now, I disagree with those points or the attributing of those points to immigration, at least alone, but they're legitimate points. They are actual genuine concerns, and immigration, at the very least, does interact with them, even if it's not the primary driver. But again, that's an open conversation. So you can't just say the anti-immigration debate is bigoted and therefore it must go. No, 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 no. Because then we'd be giving the government the means to suppress debate about affordable housing, cost of living, what is a sustainable level of immigration, and on what basis. These are all legitimate debates. Yes, racism can definitely taint them, but it doesn't have to. So we start with the most obvious unethical groups, the Nazis. Very simple. I'm also looking at the Islamic extremism. Bondi has brought that back to the fore, and rightly so. It's just another form of extremism with a very nasty history, much like Nazism. But I'm also going to be looking into sovereign citizens. Following the police shooting late in 2025, they've formally stepped into the bounds of violent extremists. So again, complex. In the sense that up until there was also quite a bit of violence during COVID, if memory serves. Yeah, there was actually, having previously worked with the Victorian police and seen some of the body-worn camera footage of sovereign citizens in action, there were quite a few violent incidents, explicitly based on political ideals. So they provide a sort of uh, middle ground, not clearly defined on the political spectrum, right? They don't necessarily have, well, they do have very clear political beliefs, but they're not really aligned with anything conventional. They're quite unconventional. That's the whole point. So that gives us an interesting, not a counterexample, but an additional test case of a violent extremist group, at least if at its fringes. Well, no, I mean, the core ideology is literal dismantling of the state, basically for individual liberty, which, in the context of having dismantled the state, largely comes down to anarchism, which a particularly unpleasant flavor of anarchism. Anyway, we could go into that for a long time. The point of the fact is they don't think the state exists, and they can say magic words that stops the law from applying to them. It's not a particularly well-founded position. Therefore, good extremist group, right? But then, yeah, so there'll be an interesting counterexample. And the theory is that from there we can work up to more complex ideologies with that ethical basis and the practicalities then established. This is just theory. At this point, we'll see what happens. I'm going to have to do a hell of a lot of reading, as I previously said. We need to establish exactly what already exists, what has been demonstrated to work, and what the gaps still are. The focus on AI may be very effective in that context. We will see. I need to hash that out with my supervisor, and we'll go from there. So anyway, the idea of these is to keep it short, sweet, weekly posts along with some text that pop up from time to time into the ethological. Oh, I used to run an ethics consultancy. Tried defining that from a business perspective. My God, still managed to get it off the ground in the end, but hey. Um, so yeah, definition, research, conceptualization. Get it done. So day one, week one. Looking forward to the next 4 years.